I'm Dan Moraine. I'm an editor over at Cal Matters and president of the Sacramento Press Club. I am delighted that Jim has come out to read Audience of One. Jim Poniewozik is, we owe a great debt to Mary Beth Barber, the fabulous Mary Beth Barber of the California State Library. He's not here, but helped arrange this, and I guess you're old buddies with Mary Beth?
Michigan Daily pals from
Michigan Daily. There you go, there you go. And thanks also to Greg Lucas, who couldn't be here, for letting us use this fabulous room in the State Library of the Stanley Mosque building. So, as a Californian, I didn't know very much at all about Donald Trump. I must be maybe the only person who's never really watched The Apprentice. But Jim has done all this for me and for you in this great book. He puts Donald Trump in historic context, in cultural context. Reading it, I love the book, but reading it, I hate it too, because really we helped create, we have in the media created Donald Trump. He is there because of Page Six and Howard Stern and Fox and the New York Times and to a lesser extent some of the West Coast media, but really to a very minor extent. He really is a creature of New York media, I think. So you've watched all this stuff. You've watched every episode of The Apprentice. Is that true, Jim?
Give or take.
Give or take.
Yeah.
And how are you feeling about that?
I sometimes compare my job to, I'm like the, radiation technician at Chernobyl who kind of has to, I've got to like strap on the hazmat suit and walk directly into the center of the meltdown to ascertain what went wrong. So, I don't know what permanent damage it has done me. It is probably not the healthiest practice, but yeah.
Well, those of us who cover the Capitol stay until 2 or 3 in the morning, and so I guess that we can sort of, we're there so you don't have to be there. But I think it's a special duty to watch episodes of The Apprentice and Fox. I mean, you're watching it all the time, right?
I should get hazard pay, Yeah, I mean, I would say, as a TV critic, you don't really have the luxury of watching anything all the time because there's so much to follow and to switch back and forth between. But, I'm certainly watching a lot more cable news than is properly, psychologically healthy from a self-care standpoint.
Well, we'll send a
not as much as Donald Trump, I should say, but nobody does.
We'll send a memo to Dean Baquet urging that he, give you a break.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, okay, thank you. Put in a word for me.
Anyway, well, so what possessed you to write this book? Why did you think that this was an important way to spend, 2 years of your life?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing was, the guy from The Apprentice got elected president of the United States. I mean, I think we're all sort of, numbed to that by now, but, this was not a case of Donald Trump didn't go off and, run for governor of New York and, move his way up through the party machinery and so on and so forth. He, his last episode of The Celebrity Apprentice aired exactly 4 months before he announced his successful presidential campaign, right? So it's like now, being a, famous TV personality and media gadfly and political, blowhard, because he had been a commentator on Fox News for several years before that too. That was now qualification in itself for the presidency, right? It was like, Caesar using his legions to, invade Gaul, or, how you could, go from being a general to becoming the United States. Now it was a new path, and I think that this really represented something having culturally, not just politically, but culturally changed in the United States, and it was something that, as somebody, number one, who had been writing for years about a lot of the cultural trends that I cover in the cultural history of this book, and who had been, one way or another, covering media personality Donald Trump that I think I had a special perspective on. And I think, once he had won the election, you were getting a lot of explainers. How did we get Trump? How did this shocking election happen? And I felt like a lot of them treated his entertainment and media career as sort of ancillary, as if he was a real estate developer who happened to get on television. And that's exactly backwards. Celebrity, mastery of the media, being famous, being omnipresent on television has always been the first thing for him. He once said, I want to put I'm going to go into real estate, but I'm going to put show business into real estate. And I really feel that, it's not like it explains everything, but really to understand where we are right now, you really have to understand the cultural element of television and this being made of pure television that it created, so this book kind of sets out to explain that piece of it.
Well, you went back and found the very first clip of his very first television interview, right? Or was it just an interview where somebody asked him a rather prescient question?
Yeah, one of Donald Trump's first national television interviews was with Rona Barrett, who you might recall from Good Morning America, famous and, in many ways, like really brilliant gossip columnist, Hollywood celebrity journalist. At this time, she was moving to NBC and was putting together a primetime special, and she decided to do a primetime special on business people and wealthy people. Rona Barrett looks at the super rich and famous. And she interviews a young Manhattan real estate family business scion named Donald Trump. And one of the questions she asks him is, would he ever consider running for president? At this time, he's like 33 years old, 34, not even actually constitutionally eligible to run for president. But I think it's very telling that the gossip columnist, this person who sort of intuited that in this celebrity culture, wealth is becoming kind of a performance in itself, and wealth and glitz and glamour could themselves be kind of a route to cultural power, that she thinks to ask it. Well, the fact that his response is, no, I don't think I would. And part of the reason he gives is what television has done to the process. He says that, I think that somebody who is maybe outspoken, who has controversial opinions, would lose out in, this television politics era to somebody with a big, pleasing, bright smile. And the thing is, at the time, he basically was right. I don't think that somebody like the Donald Trump of 2015 could have just jumped off a TV show and run for president in 1980 and won. That was the year Ronald Reagan was running for president at the time. Yes, a movie actor, but somebody who had been the governor of this great state for a couple of terms and so forth. And he was, dealing at the time with the notion that, maybe Americans wanted to vote for him, but a lot of people saw him as too dangerous or belligerent. Could you trust him with the bomb? And he had to sort of sell himself to the America by showing a sense of humor and an avuncular side, that sort of big bright smile. And I think the journey getting from the point to where Donald Trump truthfully tells Rona Barrett, a guy like me couldn't win on TV, to the point where he goes on Fox and Friends to kick off his campaign and basically becomes president because of TV. Something huge has changed, and a big part of that change is TV itself.
Well, he had been seeding this, right? I mean, do you think it was intentional, his omnipresence on Fox and his Apprentice? When do you think it actually clicked that, oh my God, I could be president?
He had flirted for years and years and years with the idea of running for president. In 2000, he actually made sort of a brief abortive run at the Reform Party primary, which had sort of become kind of a celebrity circus at that point, and then he dropped out of it. In 1988, he teased the idea of running for president or even being George H.W. Bush's vice president. It was never really clear how much of that was sincere and how much was, publicity, because everything was publicity with him, and, it certainly was a means of getting attention. It would get him, headlines for a while. But I think, certainly at least on some level, the idea, that it was just the pinnacle of power, and it was, in a way, the president is the biggest celebrity in the country. I think that was always attractive to him. I think maybe once he got on The Apprentice, and, it's just a big thing being in America's living rooms, week after week after week, becoming a familiar presence, and then, sort of porting that character over into Fox News, where I don't know, maybe we do or don't have many regular Fox News viewers here. This is California, but even if you watch The Apprentice, you may not have known that he had a regular segment on Fox and Friends, Mondays with Trump, for 4 years before he ran for president, and that was a big part of kind of bonding him with the Republican audience and creating a platform, for which to run for president. So long story short, I think that once he achieved that level of fame and became, a sought-out political spokesman, even if it was through like crazy stuff like the birther crusade, which only built his profile in Fox world, I think then he saw it as really possible.
So Fox on its best day has how many viewers?
It depends what show you're talking about. Primetime cable news. Fox is still the highest rated show in total audience, and I'm just going to say ballpark, like somebody like Kennedy is getting like 3 or 4 million people a night, which is probably the highest cable news total audience, or close to it. Sometimes Maddow will beat him, but ballpark, that's what it is.
So 3-4 million, and Bob Mulholland will know the answer to this. How many votes will it take to win the election in 2020? 65 million. Right. Yeah. So it's a fraction of a fraction, right?
Yeah.
And so why does it have such outsized impact?
Number one, and obviously this is part of the story of the book, the fracturing of America is in part the fracturing of media. Every TV audience now, essentially, except the Super Bowl, is a part of a part. But number one, those people who are watching Hannity every night, those are like the dedicated part of the Republican core, number one. So, if you look at politics often as an enterprise of winning over the base first and then, conquest from there, that's a big part of reaching the base, number one. And number two, a lot of what cable news does is it seeds other media platforms. You might not watch CNN, but if Rudy Giuliani goes and melts down at Chris Cuomo, you might see that on Facebook or on your Twitter feed the next day, or covered in other in other news. And then of course these channels have big cumulative audiences of people who are watching one show or another. So I think that, and particularly because of the political intensity of its audience that Fox cultivates, it has an outsized influence, I think undeniably, in the Republican Party now, to the point where people are basically like deciding their stances on impeachment or whatever issue of the day based on how they think it's going to play on Fox and whether that in turn is going to get them primaried.
So why don't you read a section that I think is emblematic of what of the difference between then and now.
All right. Yeah. Sure.
This, just to set it up, this is Vice President Nixon.
So I'll just read this from here so we don't have to worry about me figuring out how to make a second microphone work. We're lucky enough I got this one. I like reading this section because I think it gives you a taste of how I try in the book to bring together. When I tell people that I've written a book about Donald Trump and television, I think people generally think it's going to be 300 pages of like why Donald Trump is watching so much Fox News. And, there's certainly unavoidably some part of that, but it's really a history going back through his entire media career, going back to, 1980, and really the history of television since its birth and how that affected culture and politics. And so I think this section gives you a little taste of this. The intro to this this is the chapter where I'm talking about Donald Trump and the 2016 campaign. And I've just talked about the Access Hollywood tape, which I'm going to guess most of you know about already. So I won't run down the section on that for you. There's also some adult language in it, so as you well know. So, having led into that, that sets up this section. The tape was a disaster. Everybody knew it. The video played on repeat on the news, and more women came out in the press with stories of having been groped and attacked by Trump, a passenger on an airplane, a contestant on The Apprentice, a reporter for People. It would be the end for any candidate, but for Trump especially. It cemented his image as a pig, a lecherous boor, a toxic, selfish caveman. TV had made Donald Trump, and now TV would end him. Space. In September 1952, Vice presidential candidate Richard Nixon was facing his political death over reports of a secret fund set up by supporters for his political travel. His running mate, Dwight Eisenhower, who never much liked him, let him twist while Republicans called on him to drop Nixon from the ticket. Nixon's one chance was to throw himself at the mercy of the red light. Television sets were then in only about 15 million households, many of them well-to-do Republican ones like Fred Trump's. Intellectual Adlai Stevenson liberals, as Rick Perlstein wrote in Nixonland, were the type who took pride in themselves already for not owning them. He bought a half hour on NBC after Texaco Star Theater, the network's biggest lead-in. He built suspense by not addressing rumors that he might quit the campaign on air. Nixon began solicitously. The best and only answer to I won't do the voice. It's always tempting with Nixon, but the best and only answer to a smear or an honest misunderstanding of the facts is to tell the truth. His version of the truth was a story of humility with a subtext of resentment. Sitting at a desk on a suburban den-like stage, his wife, Pat, gazing lovingly at him from a floral print chair in the corner, hands clasped on the top of her sensible skirt. He laid out his assets and debts, a 1950 Oldsmobile, 2 mortgages, and $3,500 owed to his parents, and reminded the audience that I don't happen to be a rich man. His script was plain dollars and cents talk, George Bailey explaining how the old building and loan worked in It's a Wonderful Life. Finally, in the moment that would give the Checkers speech its name, he confessed one gift from a supporter that he would not return, a little Cocker Spaniel dog that his daughter Tricia named Checkers. Viewers sent 2 million telegrams to the Republican National Committee, nearly all in Nixon's support. That little Cocker Spaniel gave America another 22 years, that's 154 in dog years, of Richard Nixon in public life. The night of October 7th, 2016, Trump released what you might consider the anti-Checkers speech to Facebook, Twitter, and cable news. He shot it at home, Trump Tower, sitting not in a bourgeois den, but against a night-lit sea of Manhattan skyscrapers. His face was red, his voice crabbed and defiant. He read his lines as if submitting to an uncomfortable medical exam. Few sights convey unhappiness as much as Donald Trump having to read something. I'm not going to do this voice either, by the way. I never said I'm a perfect person, nor pretended to be someone that I'm not, he said. I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize. The apology portion of the video took precisely 20 seconds. The remaining minute and change pivoted back to his sales pitch. We're living in the real world. This is nothing more than a distraction from the important issues we are facing today. Then he counter-pivoted to an all-out attack. Bill Clinton has actually abused women, and Hillary has bullied, attacked, shamed, and intimidated his victims. We will discuss this more in the coming days. See you at the debate on Sunday. Nixon, who, like his audience, grew up with a pre-televisual idea of rhetoric and argument, took 30 minutes to lay out a case. Trump, whose motor, idled at the speed of 2016 media, went from contrition to intimidation in 90 seconds. Did any person with eyes and ears believe the guy in the video was sorry for anything? The guy in the video sure as hell didn't. If anything, political reporter Maggie Haberman wrote in the New York Times, Mr. Trump's video statement was a truncated version of a speech he had given countless times. The recording was the illustration of the most objectionable program principle of polarizing the audience. Whatever you thought of Donald Trump before it, you believed it twice as much now.
So he's such a... today, how do you feel he is as a character on television?
Today as president? So one of the things that I learned in the harrowing research about The Apprentice we talked about was that this is a little backstory to how he performs now. One benefit that it gave him was that he was working with professional TV producers and editors. And they were able to create a persona and an image for him of somebody who was decisive and straight shooting and knew the right decision to make and would say it flat out, you're fired, even if it was mean, even if it was rough, that's business, that's life, too bad, right? But what would often actually happen would be that they would go in the Apprentice boardroom and he'd get annoyed at somebody or just something would be eating at him and he would fire somebody almost randomly for no reason that could be explained by the challenge the contestants were doing before then. And the producers would look at each other and basically say, like, hey, what do we do with this? Like, there's nothing in what we have that justifies this decision they made. So they would have to go back and edit the episode, the rest of it that led up to the boardroom scene, in order to confer coherence on Donald Trump's decision, right? Because this is one of many cases, as we'll see throughout this book, where Donald Trump had partners who were as invested in creating the illusion of him as he was. The Apprentice needed to seem like a legitimate big deal show, and therefore its host had to be a legitimate big deal businessman, right? So, okay, so, cut to Donald Trump as president. There is obviously a lot that he does very well, communications-wise in terms of, feeding red meat to his base, the the rallies, keeping, the people who are most behind him solidly behind him. One thing that is very different with him as president is that it's like we're living in the unedited version of the reality show, right? Like, he will go out and, see something on TV and toss up something on Twitter that, contradicts some policy of his administration or undercuts something that he had done before that his administration was doing or that, is factually untrue or, and becomes the news of the day. And basically, it becomes, job one of like the entire White House to like find some way in which Mr. Trump is technically true. He doesn't have Mark Burnett, the producer of The Apprentice, to go in and like, clean it up in post-production now. He had to rely on Sean Spicer and Mike Pence. So that is a bit of a liability now.
Well, the goal of at least network TV is to make it is to have as wide an audience as possible, right?
Yeah, or at least it used to be. Yeah, I mean
it used to be.
Yeah.
But I would guess The Apprentice, he wanted as big an audience as he possibly could have gotten.
Yeah, you always want as many viewers as you can get, right?
And so, but today, I think more than half the country turns off the television when he comes on. Do you think that is so? Is he connecting? Or does it matter to him at this point?
I mean, I think this sort of goes to the political question. It's the same, political question as when people have said, well, maybe his poll numbers would be higher if he had come in and done infrastructure, some like big, non-ideological thing that would have gotten a lot of moderates and even Democrats behind him, and, he could be riding high at 60% now, and in the same way, you could say, well, why doesn't he just like, turn the clock back to like the sort of more soft-spoken Donald Trump who spoke to Rona Barrett, back in 1980, and try to sort of rhetorically appeal to more people. There was that litany of pundits saying after he became president, surely he'll become more presidential now. But it's really it's not in his character. Like, I think if he were able to do that, he wouldn't be Donald Trump, and maybe he wouldn't be the same person who sort of inflamed his base, and then, through a lot of, sort of brilliant unconventional politics / lucky breaks, ended up getting elected president. I think part of the thing is that, he has been very much a creature of television and celebrity for like 40 odd years now. And what you do as, somebody who's playing yourself in public like that is you find out what are the parts of your character, your persona, that the audience eats up, and then you give them more than that. It's like a psychological kind of test, like a pigeon, hitting a lever in a lab or whatever, right? Like you produce the output that gives you and so he had been on The Apprentice and just in public on Fox News, been rewarded with attention for years and years and years by being deliberate, by being, belligerent, by being, the feisty, you're fired guy, by being, identifying himself as a fighter, which, in many ways is, the thing that a lot of his hardcore supporters love about him most. And so I just think his instinct is to go to that thing that he's been rewarded for. And I don't think he could. Partly depends what the question means. I mean,
the next president go back.
Like the next, by chronicling the ways that a reality TV host became president and the forces that put him there, and the ways that politics in many ways has become reality TV, I'm not thereby arguing that, Jeff Probst is going to be the next president or whatever. That in other words, that this is now the only way of becoming president. What it is one way now of getting to power that used to exist. But the forces, whether Donald Trump leaves office in 1 year or 5 years or next week, yeah. But regardless, whether that happens, like, it's not just going to be like, oh, it's like he was never there, and we just go back to, but all the cultural forces that put him in office would have existed whether he was there or not. They will continue to exist. The politically polarized audience, Fox News is not going to go off the air if he resigns tomorrow. All those cultural pressures that kind of, make our culture loud and oriented toward conflict and so on, that's going to continue. You can't just snap your fingers and make it be like, 1975 again and everybody trusts Walter Cronkite. But, I also think that it is possible. There are different ways of telling a story in media and popular culture. The Apprentice was on NBC for years and years and years, but so was West Wing. Which sort of, not to like be too glib about it, but really sort of offered a different message on not just politics, but like how humans relate to one another. And you could say that the president before Donald Trump, Barack Obama, was in many ways a media figure, a almost sort of entertainer in chief. A kind of person in the way that he communicated, but obviously with a very different style and a much less sort of zero-sum view of the world. So I think you can't go back, but it also doesn't always have to be this way.
Is there any other politician or figure out there who you think takes up his mantle when he's gone, because he's not going to be there forever and ever and ever?
I could totally see somebody, and I can't necessarily, I don't have a specific name that I would predict, but I could totally see somebody from Fox News running for president, a Fox News host, like in the near future, as in the next few presidential elections. I'm not the only one to have this idea. My colleague Farhad Manjoo, who's a columnist for the Times, has suggested that Tucker Carlson might run someday. And I don't know if he has that ambition. I could certainly see somebody like Sean Hannity, who seems to love political influence. Because if you're coming from that standpoint, from that place, Donald Trump was essentially a Fox News personality before he ran, and I think that as much as The Apprentice was a big factor in what made him able to do that. But if you're coming from that background, if you've been on something like Fox for a long time, it's not just that you have this fan base among Republican primary voters or whatever, but it's more than that. It's that you sort of understand on a gut and professional level, because you've been doing it all this time, that this is really what a lot of people see politics as now. That it's about mouthing off, and about sort of dramatically and theatrically fighting and casting the world in enemies, and drawing liberal tears and so on. So that's and a lot of Trump's rhetoric as a politician and candidate essentially came from Fox News. So I couldn't see why somebody who's telegenic enough to do on Fox could do that today. Conversely, on the Democratic side, like I think that because parties are different, I think the sort of cultural figure who might appeal to a certain party would. But people have laughed about the idea of Oprah Winfrey running for president someday as a Democrat. But like the way her communication style and worldview is suited to the party, I think the main thing keeping her from doing it is that she probably just enjoys being Oprah more. But I certainly wouldn't laugh at her chances if she were to run in some future election.
No, I don't think too many people in this room would either. What's Donald Trump Jr.'s future?
Oh, I actually think that he is, I didn't really even think of this, but he is certainly, depending how the Trump presidency ends and how it's kind of viewed by Republicans afterwards, I think that he is somebody that I could see being a Donald Trump of the future. He certainly seems interested in a political career, and he also has more than the other, more than Ivanka or Eric. He seems to have that sort of political trolling, jabbing at people on Twitter thing down to an art, and like really enjoys it in the way that his father does. I think like stylistically, he's more it's a lot more believable to me to see him becoming the leader of that wing of the Republican Party than like Tom Cotton, who is maybe more is maybe very ideologically Trumpist, but he doesn't have that political showbiz style.
That's certainly true. Well, so I'm sure this engaged audience has a few questions. Mr. Mulholland.
Yeah, I felt the Democrats.
Actually, Mr. Mulholland, can you wait? We want to make sure that we get everything on mic.
Yeah, us Democrats lost the race, but Trump, I thought, won the race the day he announced when he said Mexicans are rapists. Mm-hmm. I come from Philly, born and grew up there, and so I know a little bit about those three states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So they're 80 to 85% white. So I think his strategy is perfect. Just keep reminding the white non-college that those elites on the coast and D.C. are the ones that are after you. And so I think right now he would win re-election.
I'm not going to make a prediction about that because I'm not. But I'm from Michigan. I was born and grew up there, went to school there, so half my life there. Yeah, I feel like I know that pretty white demographic pretty well too. And I think that's true. There is a section in the book where I write a bit about. I sort of try to culturally unpack the phrase "Make America Great Again," which is basically a cultural nostalgia pitch. And it is something that it can appeal to racism like that without having to, at least in that case, be overtly racist, right? Because you're basically just saying, there was a time when people like you got more respect. People like you used to be the main thing in America, and now you're not. You got to press 1 for English, this and that. It calls up all those associations without, and people can map them on whatever grievance they have, on whatever sense that their group is being replaced in America, and that certainly was not a liability for him with, you know, a unfortunately big section of America.
Did you find that in digging back through his television past, his media past, this sort of racist thread?
You know, not necessarily. It certainly, when you look through his life as a public figure, you know, you can go back to the 1980s and his campaign against the Central Park Five in New York, who he called for the death penalty for, and they've been exonerated, and he has never been willing to admit that they were exonerated, and like still insists that he was right. And you know, that was a very as sort of in you know. Public political gadfly, yeah, you know, he had that thread of, you know, not like overt, but pretty close to overt, you know, race baiting. There's this you know thing with Donald Trump about how he uses the word animals and uses it only for you know, accused criminals or killers or whatever who are not white. Like if you look at his tweets and like when he is, you know, referred to, you know, a white mass shooter does something and the person is, you know, sick or whatever. But if it is somebody who is a person of color, he'll use animal, like he did back with the Central Park Five, and that has been like a theme with him, and that is very telling in itself. But in his public persona, you know, interestingly, and particularly say on The Apprentice, where again, he's being managed by, you know, television producers who want to, you know, they certainly don't want to put on a show where their host looks racist, you know, regardless of what people have said he is, you know, would say in comments backstage, you know, we've heard all those rumors. What made it on the screen was actually a show that, you know, tended to be cast pretty diversely compared to, you know, network TV shows of the time. There were certainly, like on a lot of reality TV shows, you know, a lot of things like casting somebody like Omarosa to, you know, play the you know, the angry black person, which is sort of a questionable racial trope that reality TV has used a lot. But in terms of, you know, sort of showing Donald Trump as the leader, you know, kind of the boss of this team that, you know, has a lot of men and a lot of women and people from different racial backgrounds, it was promoting really the image of him in a way as sort of a multiculturally advanced figure. And in fact, you know, interestingly, in the early days of The Apprentice, it actually had very high, like popular, I think it's like Q rating figures among audiences of color, you know, in part because of this. You know, obviously, once he becomes more overtly, you know, political and, you know, starts calling, you know, the first African-American president of the United States, you know, saying that he faked his birth certificate, et cetera, you know, then that went away. But in his public TV presence, it was often just the opposite.
Whitewash, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you talk to Burnett, Mark Burnett?
Not for this book. I've talked to him, like I've interviewed him for a lot of things just over the course of, you know, writing about reality TV. He's very tight-lipped about Donald Trump right now, for, you know, possibly understandable reasons. I mean, like when it comes up with him, it's like he's getting a tooth extracted now.
And of course, Roger Ailes isn't giving too many interviews, but I'm wondering if you ever talked to him about Trump.
I've never interviewed Roger Ailes. And that's partly because being, you know, an entertainment TV critic, I'm generally not covering sort of, you know, like the corporate end of TV news in that way.
Other questions?
You have both mentioned or alluded to Burnett and tapes that may or may not exist that talk about the president, or that where the president speaks. Do you, in your book or here now, have any comments about the rumors that Burnett has been blackmailed by Trump's organization?
I know whether or not the tapes are real, and you have to buy my book to find out.
That's the one part we're not covering tonight.
No, I can't shed any light on that. You know, either whether the notorious tapes actually exist or ever existed, or you know whether they've been covered up for some reason. Your guess is as good as mine. But believe me, by the way, if I'd had evidence one way or the other on that, like that would be on the cover of this book.
Back there, Jeff, yes.
A lot of TV programs, including The Apprentice, you know, run out of gas after a certain number of seasons.
Yep.
He ran out of gas with a lot of his lenders at the banks that lent to him. Do you see this act running out of gas with the American public in the sense that people just get tired of it after a while?
Well, yeah. See, that's the thing. And again, I avoid making too many predictions because I'm just lousy at making political predictions. But when people ask me about that, you know, like, will people tire of Trump, you know, enough for him to lose re-election or whatever, I talk about the Apprentice ratings as sort of, you know, a parable. Donald Trump was on The Apprentice for 14 seasons, you know, which is a long time in TV. That was a very successful run. However, The Apprentice was only a really big hit its first season. He calls it, you know, he likes to call it, through his, you know, trademark Trumpian exaggeration, the #1 show on television. In fact, it was the #1 show on television exactly 1 week, the week of its season 1 finale. And then, but if you know any TV critics, you know, we can tell you he would go to every Television Critics Association press tour after that and still say and insist that his publicists say that it was the #1 show on television. Years after that, there was like a preview of Sean Spicer saying, you know, biggest inauguration ever. It was like basically the same thing. But after that one big first season, you know, NBC and Trump and Burnett sort of did with the show what a lot of TV networks do with a hit, which was they overexposed it. They ran it twice a year. Trump really amplified his performance. You know, his "you're fired" had become a catchphrase. So his, you know, the kind of character he's playing on the show, you see as you watch more and more of these seasons, becomes more brash and obnoxious and, you know, mean, because like that was the character that the audience was responding to. And with that came a kind of burnout, and the ratings declined really sharply, so that they were about half as much by the 4th season. And, you know, by those later seasons, it was sort of a consistent, because reality shows are relatively cheap to make, but not high-rated show for NBC, which is all by way of saying, you know, that, you know, okay, in TV you can do that. In TV you can be #1 your first season and then decline, but sort of reach a plateau and, you know, finish 3rd in your time slot and, you know, make money for your network for quite a while. But in an election, if you finish 3rd, you lose. So, you know, so the question is basically, you know, I think it is entirely possible at the same time that, you know, as we were talking about with, you know, his like racial appeal and Make America Great Again and those 80,000 votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that, you know, that could be enough to get him over the top a second time. But another way of looking at that is that he kind of barely won the last time, and it is, you know, he does not have that much elbow room for the audience to burn out. That's a long way of avoiding making a prediction. Yeah, but I'm saying that it's a helpful way to look at it. Yeah, I read that. It's a great book.
The downside of that is that people are allowed to believe whatever they want to believe. And it strikes me that somebody like Donald Trump has exploited that element, that you can change from day to day what you believe, and you have this figure who is not an emulgatory, but he has aspects of that. Does that sort of make sense to you?
Oh yeah, sure. No, I think that is totally a big part of. That's a big tool in his toolbox. The book he's referring to is Fantasyland by the writer Kurt Anderson, which came out a couple of years ago and is a great book. I recommend it to anybody, and it's definitely connected with this. I say this not just because Kurt Anderson blurred my book, but there are definitely similar themes. And what he's writing about is this notion that from its beginning, America has sort of been susceptible to magical thinking and various ideas that you are free to do whatever you want, so you can kind of create your own reality and believe what you want and will it into being. And that kind of often it unleashes a certain amount of sense of possibility, but it also means that people are susceptible to wackadoodle cults and all sorts of things. And I do think that one common thread between that and American history generally and Trump's campaign is this notion that I do particularly get into in the chapter on his campaign, that there isn't relative truth, or that there isn't absolute truth, that everything's relative, and you should believe what you want to believe, and certainly that has been a big, and I think even not politically, just as a journalist, somebody who is dedicated to the idea that there are at least some objective, knowable facts in the world, has been dedicated to politically undermining the fact that the idea of that there's any sort of expertise, that you can believe experts about anything, that you can believe facts that are uncomfortable about you for anything, and just encouraging people to take this sort of cynical and tribal attitude that everything in the world is a lie, so might as well believe what works for my side. I mean, I say this a lot when I'm talking about this book, but the perfect example is fake news, right? Which was a term that once referred to actual hoaxes that appeared on Facebook and so on. And Trump quickly sort of secured the copyright on that and started to use it himself for news that he didn't like. And now, when he says fake news, I think what's really interesting is that almost nobody, Donald Trump and most of the people who like Donald Trump, nobody hears fake news and thinks, this is something that is actually false and fiction. They think, this is something that is true, but it's unfair. It's true, but it's disrespectful. It's true, but it's bad for our side. It's true, but people want to know it for bad reasons because it will hurt the things that are important to me. So we can just toss it over to the side. And that is, once you sort of make that acceptable, it becomes anything's possible. It's true. That's. But it feels true, right? Which was the catchphrase that people used around Trump's campaign. Take him seriously, but don't take him literally. Which is sort of permission to say, maybe he's not factually right, or maybe he's totally making up a lie. But it feels right on a gut level, and isn't that all that matters?
Question over here.
Yeah.
Question over here in the back.
So I think we got to spread it around now. Yeah. I mean, long term, I think television is going to be less proportionally important, and social media and the internet and this, even more distributed and fragmented form of media will become more influential. Ironically, one weird side effect of Donald Trump's campaign, as much as he used Twitter, which is, obviously a whole other big media aspect of him, was that his campaign ended up reinforcing the kind of power and influence of television at a time when it was thought to be declining, because, so much of what his success in the campaign was due to getting so much free airtime on CNN and Fox and MSNBC. But, long term, I think that number one, long term, I think that social media is going to be a bigger part of that picture. broader terms, in terms of TV, just speaking as a TV critic, not just talking about news, certainly the switch to streaming is going to change the entire culture of television and how people consume it. But that Netflix and so forth haven't really, because they're not about live events, they haven't really supplanted or moved into the news area. So I'm not sure that will have as much effect there.
Yes, thank you. And a quick observation, then a question, please. Observation, we're discussing the Trump supporters, right? And seemingly the commonality in the Trump supporters is they're all victims, and he's the head victim. And everyone's after them, and he's protecting them. Question. Today, Trump forbid the federal government from receiving the Post and the Times. He attacks the Times relentlessly. What's the mood in the newsroom? Is it a siege mentality or business as usual?
No, I mean, I think, I think that taking it seriously.
Do you work in the Times newsroom?
Oh yeah, I work in the Times. I should say I work in the Times newsroom in New York, and I'm a TV critic. I'm not in the office that often. I'm watching screens. So I don't want to come off. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm all the at all the page one meetings and know what's being said there. But in general, I mean, in part. Number one, just the subscription boost that the Trump administration has given the Times and the Post, was certainly just a big bottom line shot in the arm. Number one, and I think honestly, having an administration that is so dedicated, as we were just talking about, to undermining the idea of truth, I think has, I don't want to sound like too much of a cheerleader, but kind of restored a sense of mission. I think the anxiety tends to be more around. People, using rhetoric like, enemy of the people and all this very, not just sort of critical or angry talk about the press, but really sort of militant talk in an era when, people are doing things like sending pipe bombs to CNN. So, I think that, anywhere in journalism, there is at least some anxiety that, that this oppositional, the nature of this oppositional talk about the media could end up in real violence at some point. I don't think anybody's sweating the fact at times that the times that Trump is asking government offices to cancel their subscriptions. But believe me, as much as Donald Trump criticizes the New York Times, he wants nothing more than the attention and approbation of the New York Times. I don't say it just because I work there. That has been his hometown paper. He has always been obsessed with his media coverage and his clips. And, in the same way that, when he says, oh, I never watch CNN, he totally watches CNN. If he says, I don't care about what the New York Times says about me, he totally cares what the New York Times says about him.
We have another question here in the back.
This question may have been asked earlier, but after his presidency, whenever it ends, do you think he'll go back to television? Could you see him going back? Could you see a television network giving him?
Well, that was again, and I can only guess. Yeah, but we're going to assume he's a free man for the purposes of this question. But that was. That was the big talk after, in 2016 when, all the smart people were assuming that he was going to lose, including the people who were running the Trump campaign, right? Was that, okay, he's setting this up to, he's going to start Trump TV, a TV network. I could totally see him doing something like that. I couldn't see him necessarily trying to do a show again. Number one, obviously, even NBC, soulless media corporation is not going to take him back to do The Apprentice at this point. And I don't think that really he would want to do something like simply host a talk show. I could see him wanting to run a TV network. And honestly, honest to God, I could see this happen, but because now you'll occasionally see winning because they ran a poll that turned out bad for him and they didn't suppress it, they changed it to make it better for him. And he'll say, oh, everybody should watch One America Network, news network now, which is this sort of competitor to, conservative competitor to Fox News that has this tiny audience. I could see him buying or starting something like that and trying to compete with it. And honest to God, I think that would be a much more difficult undertaking than running for president and winning. trying to start a competitor to Fox News, and just because of all of the boring reasons that the TV business, and starting a cable network like that is so competitive, I think that it would be much harder to do it. But I could see him trying that. I think he would love to be running Fox, and since he can't run Fox, he would like to have his own.
Do you see parallels between the way Trump is manipulating the media and using the media, and historically what the National Socialist Party did in Germany during the 30s with the media of the day?
I think I'm too much of a dilettante in like European and Nazi history to say that flat out. So I wouldn't venture a guess at that. I will say that like if you go now, and I talk about this somewhat in the book, and look at somebody like Hannah Arendt, who wrote about totalitarianism and the Nazis and Stalin and so on. You certainly see, if it's not the same thing, like it definitely rhymes in terms of this notion of attacking the truth. What we were just talking about, like this notion of like encouraging people, you can believe whatever you want because nothing is real, and you should just listen to your Stephen Colbert's truthiness, right? Listen to your gut over your head. And one, you may have heard this, but like one Hannah Arendt quote that I think really rings true now, and I don't remember it exactly, but she talks about how in a totalitarian state, the point of the object of the state is not to create people who just totally credulously believe lies. It's to create a public that believes that there is no truth. And I think that is at least very similar.
So, Jim, I have a sort of a practitioner's question, if I may, just quickly.
Earlier, you characterized him as a television personality, showman, etc., implying that it would take something more than that. Someone would have to beat him at his own game. And obviously, none of the Democratic candidates that I've seen have that potential.
Yeah.
So what's it going to take?
I actually don't think somebody has to like beat him at his own game, in the sense that if you're running against Trump, I think probably the worst thing to do would be to like try to out-Trump Trump, like try to be another version. I think what you have to be able to do is to deliver it in a sort of charismatic, attention-getting message through the media, and in this arena of the media that will inspire and bring together people who don't vote for Trump. In the same way that like if The Apprentice or Survivor becomes a hit show on television, it doesn't mean that all shows on TV are going to become The Apprentice or Survivor. You counter program. That's a term for TV. You present an appealing but unlike alternative that might catch people's attention and win them over, particularly if they're starting to burn out on last season's big show.
What?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I don't know how likely mechanically in a primary it is to enter that late now, but sure. Yeah.
So in order to become the New York Times chief television critic, did you study propaganda? Did you have to the book has a really, I mean, whether you studied it or not, you tell a story of propaganda in this book.
Yeah,
creating a persona and illusion.
I didn't study propaganda. I'm sort of, you're sort of soaking in it, as a TV critic, number one. But also, what I did, I was an English major in college, And I think I have one of the few jobs in the world for which that actually has practical applications. One thing that that I learned studying literature and literary criticism was, and particularly in the 80s when I was in college, one big literary critical approach that was popular at the time was postmodernism, there were a lot of I studied a lot of thinkers and writers who were concerned with this notion of the artificial and the simulacrum, the idea that in a society that was sort of overwhelmed with media images, in a video-based society, people are so accustomed to seeing sort of polished media images and reproductions that the simulacrum, the fake thing, seems more real to people than the real thing does. And that was something that I definitely applied here. Because, if there's one thing I want you to take away about my image of Donald Trump here, is that his skill and his insight from the beginning that made him who he was that he understood intuitively that it is more important in this world today to seem like the thing than to be the thing. It's more important to surround yourself with the signifiers of wealth and glamour and glitter and success than to actually be the most successful businessman in New York. That creates an image that you can leverage. And one of those thinkers that I quote in the book was Umberto Eco. Was the Italian who wrote The Name of the Rose, among other things, but he was also a great literary critic. And in the 1970s, he wrote this essay called Travels in Hyperreality, where he went across America visiting reproductions of things, like an exact replica of Lyndon Johnson's Oval Office, wax museums, other reproductions, and he went to Disneyland, and he talked about how when you ride on the riverboat ride, the Wild River ride in Disneyland, you'll see that Disney has all these animatronics, and they would have these robot crocodiles in the water that would rise up out of the water and open their jaws really wide and roar at you. And in actual nature, he said, if you go on, an actual wild river ride and you see an alligator, it generally seems really disappointing. They're kind of floating there. It's probably asleep. It's like you can see half of its back out of the water. And he says, in this sort of dream version of the real seems more real to people because it corresponds more to your imagination. And that is like the essence of Donald Trump. Fran Lebowitz once called him, a poor person's idea of a rich person. And that's why he was so perfect for reality TV. Like The Apprentice, reality TV needs, big, broad symbols. Survivor is, a shut-in's idea of what it's like to live on a desert island. And it's like The Apprentice didn't need an actual businessman. It needed, the dream illusion of a businessman. And Trump had been making himself that for 20 years at that point.
Question back there.
When people were scoffing at Trump might possibly win, Michael Moore predicted that he very well could and warned people that the American public was so fed up with politics and politicians, they were ready to throw a Molotov cocktail at the system, which the question about running out of gas is pointed, because that's what happened. And while we're talking about style and media and the last few decades, it's striking that the thread that's missing is qualifications, and we don't talk about that anymore. And has that horse just left the barn, that it is all about appearing to be something and that's enough? Or do people remember term limits, no professional politicians, let's get rid of them? And now this is why we have what we have. So we don't talk about what are his qualifications to be president.
Yeah, I mean, obviously my book focuses on, the media and culture end of this, because that's, my specialty. I certainly don't, I think that is a piece of it. It doesn't, explain everything. A lot of the things that Donald Trump used as his appeal, as a media figure and as somebody who ran for president on TV, they had antecedents in political rhetoric before that, outside of the media. The notion that the country should be run like a businessman, so maybe we need a businessman for president. Like, that wasn't invented by Donald Trump. That was something that politicians had been saying for decades. And this notion that those bums who have been in Washington forever don't know anything. That's one of the oldest political arguments in the world. Where they kind of dovetail and where they go hand in hand is that if you are very practiced at using the media and creating that illusion and getting attention and presenting yourself as the sort of outrageous, like a character from a movie where a billionaire runs for president, and that can appeal to these existing threads in the political discourse, and in a way, like, your lack of experience or your outrageousness, your offensiveness becomes, at least to if there's a lot of dissatisfaction existing for other reasons, it becomes a selling point rather than a distracting point, because like you're the biggest rock to throw through the window. Now, I mean, again, I don't think that means that, so this is just what all presidents are going to be from now on. Politics swings like pendulums. I think, to some extent now, you even see, obviously, I think this is more in the Democratic primary, partly because the Democrats are running a primary now. But this notion of at least some voters being more drawn to the idea of experience than they might have been a while ago, sort of in reaction to Donald Trump. So I don't think that's necessarily out the window. But like I said, and why I decided to write the book, it's another thing that's on the menu. It is certain. We've realized it is possible to walk right off the TV screen and into the Oval Office with no experience, and that possibility will not go away.
Well, certainly he was experienced with media. I think we have time for about one more question, and then Jim can maybe sign a few books.
Sure.
I am a New York Times subscriber, and I noticed on
hero.
I pay full price. And I noticed Sunday morning, there's always the recap of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
And what happened. And then I think every night they do a recap of the late night talk shows, which seems to be a fairly new thing since the Trump administration started. And then I think it was in the New York Times, I read that late night talk shows now are aiming to get more reporters and writers that cover the Trump administration. They're hotter than actors and typical celebrities. I was wondering, your take on that. I guess TV is entertainment, but politics and entertainment, and how people get their news. The Daily Show seemed to start that, and maybe now it's continuing. Is it a short-term thing? Is this going to continue? Is it good for journalists? Is it a way that we're going to, interact, find out about politics through Saturday Night Live, Conan, Stephen Colbert? What's your take?
I mean, part of the thing is that there are so many late night shows now. It's not like in Johnny Carson's day. There's so many of them, and a lot of them are very different. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for people to be getting information or political discourse from late night shows. I mean, Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. And I think The Daily Show now too, but I just think Trevor Noah has a little bit of a different sort of angle and approach. The Daily Show was I thought a brilliant piece of media criticism basically every night. In a country where we don't really teach media literacy. So I think that that's very good. I think that the notion of sort of late night monologues and comedy being kind of the pulse of politics and being even influential in politics, that's something that had been going on for a long time, and I think that's likely to continue. I think though that, like everything else in media, it's becoming more and more dispersed. There are a lot more late night shows, but all of them have a fraction, in terms of audience of what The Tonight Show used to do. And, now there are, political commentary shows on Netflix, and, people do stuff online and on YouTube and all of that. So, I think that, late night shows, they were sort of like the ground zero of, politics and entertainment merging. And I think that general trend will continue. But, I think that stuff that we get from late night shows will probably be coming from, more and more places, including online video and stuff, going into the future.
Right. Well, on behalf of the Sacramento Press Club and the California State Library and the fabulous Mary Beth Barber, thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you. Great to thank all of you. Thank you.
And November 4th, the Press Club will be hosting Surgeon General Nadine Burke-Harris. And November 19th, the author of Homewreckers will be here.